Good evening and good Tuesday evening, and welcome to our virtual NBC6 Voices on our Facebook and YouTube pages. I'm Juwan Strader. Well, we will remember 2020 as the year of the coronavirus and civil unrest after the death of unarmed Black men across our country and women by police. But now there's a new presidential administration in Washington. So what will social justice look like in 2021? Melba Pearson is the Director of Policy and Programs for the university's Center for the Administration of Justice. She's also a civil rights and criminal law attorney and a recent candidate for Miami-Dade State Attorney. Many of you may recognize Madam Pearson, Melba. And Dr. Tamika Hobbs is the Provost for Academic Affairs and founding director of the Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial University. Welcome to both of you this evening to our very enlightened conversation that we hope to have on social justice issues. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
A lot has happened this week. Let's get right to it. President Biden signed 4 executive actions aimed at advancing racial equality for Americans that he says has been underserved and left behind. So that they direct the housing department to disavow racism geared at Asian Americans connected to COVID-19. In the Justice Department's use of private prisons, address racial bias in housing, and commits the government to respecting tribal sovereignty. So my first question to the both of you is, do these executive orders go far enough? Melba, let's start with you.
So thank you again for this, Juwan. I believe that this is basically the opening act, right? So this is the beginning of what we can see from this administration. I firmly believe that this is just his way of warming up to let us know that he is centering social justice. He is the first president to explicitly call out white supremacy as in his inaugural speech, as well as subsequent speeches he's given since then. So this is the beginning. We're going to see more, I think, in terms of policing, especially when it comes to police brutality. He has prioritized prosecutorial misconduct. I believe we're going to see more around the ending of minimum mandatories and possibly even a push towards the legalization of cannabis on the federal level. So we have a lot to look forward to in the next 4 years.
No, we sure do. And Dr. Hobbs, I want to hear from you. Do you believe it goes far enough? I mean, this is unprecedented, though, because I've never known of an administration to do something like this, especially right off jump.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with Melba, what she says. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. After what we've been through over the past 4 years, it is indeed really something to have a president who would make the statements that Joe Biden has made in these early weeks of his administration. As Melba pointed out, a repudiation of white supremacy, naming white supremacy. I think for me, the other thing that really catches my attention is that what we see in these executive orders, all the series of them taken together, is a presidency, an administration that understands systemic racism. When we look at the policy and the executive order that was issued for housing and urban development, this whole issue of redress, going back and examining the historic harm that the U.S. government is accountable for, is responsible for, that has created this economic inequality and inequity. That for me is really, really huge. And I think that the very first executive order that he issued dealing with racial equity is quite important as well, and sets the tone when we talk about him and giving a directive to the Office of Management and Budget to do an investigation across the agency to determine whether or not there is really and truly equity taking place in the government. And that sets the tone, I think, for the entire nation.
And Dr. Hobbs, I want to stay right there with you. I want to ask you, what were the biggest changes you saw last year in terms of social justice?
I think for me, when I talk about these issues and understanding my own evolution and coming into this movement back in 2012 with Trayvon Martin and seeing the following year in 2013, the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, what you see in 2020 was Black Lives Matter become PC. There was this endorsement at so many levels finally people could get it. I actually think that part of the reason was that we were in quarantine. Our lives had slowed down. We were at home. And many people who probably otherwise might not have batted an eye had to take the time, or forced to take the time, or had the time to look at what happened to George Floyd, to ponder what happened to Breonna Taylor, and acknowledge that there was a serious, serious wrong that was going on in these instances, and that perhaps that all of the noise that they'd seen in the years previous, that there was actually something going on there. And so for me, not only that kind of acknowledgement and engagement, we have never seen civil rights protests like that take place, that large, that numerous across our nation or the globe. And then we begin to see corporate America and our government change its tune. And at Florida Memorial, it's why we put our stake in the ground and said that we are going to create the Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial University as the only historically Black college in the region, to be a part of that change, to study, to advocate for racial equality and social injustice. And so I think that we really have a mainstream conversation. My expectation of the Biden-Harris administration is that they stay true to their campaign promises, that they acknowledge the constituency that helped them to win office, and that they deliver on redress of these systemic wrongs.
And Melba, what type of social justice changes would you like to see in 2021?
So certainly I want to see a continuation of that centering and repudiation of white supremacy and understanding how it impacts so many different aspects. I'm really heartened by the desire to put education first, because education is really the thing that gives you that gateway to economic success and to be able to support yourself and your family without having to turn to illicit means to be able to survive, right? So that discussion around education, especially supporting historically Black colleges and universities, supporting people who have lower income and normally would be unable to attain a college education, support vocational programs so that young people are able to get a trade. Again, when you're able to have a vocation that enables you to support your family and support yourself, you are less likely to be engaged in a life of crime. Additionally, I'm really looking forward to seeing that legalization of cannabis, because as we're seeing across the country, so many states have legalized it for recreational purposes, even more have legalized it for medical purposes. And at the end of the day, that discrepancy between state and federal law is causing disparities. And then lastly, when we're looking at the enforcement aspect, the fact that cannabis is still not legalized on a federal level enables law enforcement to use that as a pretense to be able to stop people and conduct searches. That then leads to a higher tension, where we then have these confrontations that can possibly turn violent. So again, not only from the economic standpoint, from the medical standpoint, from a justice standpoint, cannabis needs to be legalized. And I think that's one of the biggest pushes that we're going to see in the next few years.
And Melba, let's stay on the topic of education a little bit, because you heard Dr. Hobbs tell us a little bit about the Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial University. So tell us about the FIU Center for the Administration of Justice. What is your role there?
So I am the Director of Policy and Programs at the Center for the Administration of Justice, and I am the co-manager of a grant that's funded by the MacArthur Foundation as part of their Safety and Justice Challenge. We are focused on working with data as a tool for transparency in prosecutors' offices. Many times the voters, the people in the communities that prosecutors serve, have no idea how prosecutors' offices are functioning, how their tax dollars are being used, and how justice is actually being administered in their areas. Many times prosecutors' offices don't even have the time to really think and look at the numbers as to how many people go to diversion, how many people do we send to prison a year, are there racial disparities between who gets what types of benefit, how are survivors of crime being served, is it taking too long for offices to reach out to them? So it's about office-wide performance management, it's about addressing racial disparities, and it's also about creating dashboards that are public-facing, so that you can have full transparency when it comes to criminal justice in our communities. And so many offices across the country are really embracing this because the voters are demanding this type of transparency. So we enable them with tools, and then I work with different elected prosecutors to shape policy so that when we see negative trends, we can ensure that we are addressing it and turning the tide.
And Dr. Hobbs, why is it important to have these centers be placed on college campuses?
I think for us at Florida Memorial University with our Social Justice Institute, what inspires me and what inspires our vision is the ability to mold future change agents. And one of the things, that's something that we take very serious. Part of our motto, our value statements is about leadership, character, and service, scholarship, and accountability. And we've infused that into the work that we're doing with the Social Justice Institute. One of the very first things that we were able to bring about was installing an advocate in residence who is a social justice practitioner in our community to be embedded on our campus, to mentor, to groom, to engage our students and our campus, faculty included, to help them understand how not just to study, but to walk the walk. And so we're very glad to have on our campus Valencia Gunder as our inaugural advocate in residence. She's been doing fantastic work. And we're really excited about what this portends about our ability as an institution of higher education to continue to push out and develop more change agents. And you have to look no further than the White House now, because we have in Vice President Kamala Harris, a graduate of an HBCU, Howard University. You have two senators who were put in place, one who is a graduate from Georgia, the Morehouse University, Reverend Raphael Warnock. He might not have had his office if it had not have been for another HBCU graduate. Of course, I'm talking about Stacey Abrams, who's a graduate of Spelman University. So as I write about in my blogs for the Social Justice Institute on our website, we are experiencing a renaissance in HBCUs. This administration has pledged $70 billion worth of investment, not only in HBCUs, but minority serving institutions. And it's finally going to give some respect to these in schools who for the last 150 years have had an outsized impact on education in the United States. We represent 3% of all institutions of higher education in the US, but collectively, when you look at all African Americans who receive bachelor's degrees, we produce 20% of them. We produce 70% of African American judges. We produce 40% of all engineers in the United States. Florida Memorial graduated the only woman, African-American woman, who has a PhD in radiochemistry. And so our outsized impact not only is in STEM, but in the law, and we want to continue to double down on that.
Amen. You're doing just that. And I want to ask you, Melba, because, it was a hot topic last year. It was a hot topic when it came to the campaigns across the country, really. And that's defunding the police. And I want to know and hear from you whether or not you're aware of any instances in South Florida that saw any changes like this happen.
At this point, I'm not aware of any movement by any of the localities to defund the police per se, but there's definitely a push towards how can we be more strategic in the way that we use our taxpayer dollars to reinvest in our communities, to reinvest in mental health services, to provide more training to advocates to be able to deal with issues that come up with in our community, as opposed to always defaulting to using the police departments, who should be focused on violent crime. Right now, we have psycho shootings in our communities, and a lovely 6-year-old girl was murdered not too long ago. That's where police resources need to be focused, as opposed to responding to some of these other cases that could be better served by a social worker or a mental health advocate. So the discussion is continuing. Unfortunately, we're seeing some legislation out of Tallahassee in the form of an anti-protest bill that is going to try to tamp down on the abilities of cities and municipalities to decide whether or not they should remove funds from the police department and reinvest it in other ways. That's an attack, I believe, in the sovereignty of and in the independence of municipalities and cities. And unfortunately, it's not allowing elected officials, if this bill were to pass, it would not be allowing elected officials to be able to do the job that the voters elected them to do. So that is something that's of concern. But this is not a discussion that's going to go away overnight. I think we're going to see something parallel to like we had under President Obama when he did the 21st Century Task Force on Policing. I think there's going to be another version of that to really explore how we can make sure that our communities are being better served, how we can make sure that our first responders are getting treatment for the trauma that they experience seeing death and horrible things on a daily basis, and also making sure that our communities are safe and people who intend to harm others are held accountable. So it's definitely a delicate balance, and all of us coming to the table to come to this solution.
Yeah, we know that's a very touchy subject when it comes to many across the country. Dr. Hobbs, what are some of the biggest areas where social justice is lacking in our state here in Florida?
I definitely come back to what we said about HBCUs and the funding for HBCUs. I think that is a desperate need. I am greatly concerned about the double pandemic. Of course, we're dealing with the outcomes of COVID-19. We have had a less than effective, putting that mildly, response at the federal level that has been echoed at the state level. We know that coronavirus is killing Black and Latinx people at sometimes 2 to 3 times the rate. The infection rate is about 2 to 3 times. And so this is a serious crisis for our community just in terms of health justice. And so we're really paying attention to policies that are going to address that COVID-19 and the impacts that it's having in our home community and in Miami Gardens. We have faculty members who are involved in studies to really illuminate and bring to light some of the issues that are taking place there. And so we have the health justice piece, which is one angle, but we also, especially in South Florida, are dealing with the fallout of the economic downturn. When you have an economy that is based on tourism, when you think about unemployment that historically for Black people in this country has always been twice what it has been for other people. When you look at what we know that there has been a significant downturn with Black-owned businesses, when you also understand that they've been excluded from some of the PPP loans. Now I'm really encouraged that Biden is trying to address that. But those are the types of things that are top of mind for our community. And I think we're going to see this double pandemic continue to echo in this community for years to come. That's where we need to be applying our resources, both with intellectual and material.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hobbs. And let's talk about some of the crime victims now, Melba, here in a little bit, because I want to talk about kids in our community being shot and killed. Recently, there was a lovely young lady that was shot and killed at a birthday party. And so often this happens here in South Florida and across the country when there are no arrests made. There's almost no accountability when we lose precious lives, especially those of color in our community. And we're seeing this more and more. But because, of course, you work with the state attorney's office, you can address this. And what is the issue here?
So it's definitely a multifaceted issue. So first off, you have the situation where people may be afraid to come forward. If they see that someone committed a murder and they know that a particular person does not have a high regard for human life, they may not want to place themselves and their loved ones at risk. That's why it's really important that there's more robust funding and expanded criteria for witness relocation, because people may feel more comfortable coming forward and saying what they saw, giving testimony, giving evidence, if they know that they and their loved ones, not just necessarily their immediate family, but their grandmother that may live down the block, that all of them can be relocated and protected. So that's one aspect. Secondly, there's a lot of fear just because people don't want to speak up. And unfortunately, law enforcement, I think many times will go to communities, do 1 or 2 rounds, asking questions. And if no one comes forward, the case remains open. So there's no pressure there. And then additionally, I think that it's a matter of developing relationships in the community before the shootings happen. So the prosecutor's office shouldn't just be acting after the fact and only working in the courtroom. They have to really be truly embedded in a meaningful way within the communities to be able to sometimes hear the information that's needed to successfully build these cases. You can't just come around when it's re-election time and think that that is going to be enough to really overcome some of these problems. There has to be really sustained efforts by law enforcement as well as prosecutors' offices, not just here in Miami, but around the country, to be able to address some of these issues. And lastly, there's the issue of resources. So if resources aren't coming to our community, so there's no job, as Dr. Hobbs had referred to the fact that many Black-owned businesses were being excluded from PPP loans. When these businesses fold, that's the source of employment within these communities. So if folks don't have jobs, there's not a whole lot of options when it comes to being able to feed yourself. That's why education and also ban the box. When you have a situation of somebody who has a criminal history, many times they're not able to get lawful employment because employers are like, oh, I see your history, I don't want you in my workplace. Well, that then continues to perpetuate the problem. So we have to really look at what are we doing for people when they come back to our communities after being in the system to make sure that they're able to work, provide for themselves, take care of their families, and live a better life. So it takes a multi-pronged approach. It's not just one solution that's going to fix everything, but we have to do this in a collaborative way, especially lifting up the voices of community advocates and community organizations that they're every day doing this work in the community.
A very good point. And Dr. Hobbs, I want to ask you the question as far as in regards to the past 4 years, we've seen a resurgence of white extremism. We've seen, a number of different organizations basically grew after many of them felt pretty much emboldened from maybe the last administration. So I want to ask you, how do you deal with this when we're talking about, social justice reforms? How do we deal with this?
Sure. One of the areas of focus that we've identified for the Social Justice Institute is systemic racism. And really what undergirds that is the ideology of white supremacy, which we started off at the top of our discussion, addressing. President Biden has named it explicitly. His predecessor would not. But for those of us who are students of history and students of racialized violence, you recognize these very dangerous patterns. And I can remember doing community anti-racism programs back in 2016 when we were going into the election season and sharing with my audience my concern about this resurgence of white violence targeted at African Americans and other people of color. And we have seen that. There have been murders, there have been attacks. We've all seen videos of this really kind of nastiness that has invaded our public sphere. And then we have the pinnacle of that behavior becoming manifest on January 6th in our nation's capital. And I'm completely stunned that there's been such a swift effort to push this to the side, to talk about unity. A police officer, Capitol Police Officer Brian Sisnick, was killed. Can you imagine if a police officer had been killed during a Black Lives Matter protest? But no one seems to want to deal with this. No one seems to want to deal with the fact that there were threats of assassination, there were threats of kidnapping, there was a breach of our nation's capital. And if you have a group of people who are convinced that their candidate lost, many scholars have been predicting that we're going to see this really resurgence or growth of domestic extremist terrorism here in the United States. And that's something that we need to be very mindful of. We need to be engaging with people to have these conversations. Part of what we've done, I've partnered with Carrie Ann Royce and others, YWCA, as well as the African American Research Library and the South Florida People of Color, to launch the South Florida Social Justice Common Read. And our next book is going to be White Rage, The Untold Truth of America's Racial Divide by Carol Anderson, who is a historian who does a fantastic job of illuminating these historic patterns of violence. And so if you're ever going to end it in the future, you have to understand these patterns. And so I think we all need to tune in. And I'm hoping that the Biden administration will have the will to press through to investigate these terroristic threats, prosecute, and make sure that this nation and our democracy is protected.
Well, I know these executive actions are definitely a start. Melba, Pearson, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Tamika Hobbs, we really appreciate you and your insight as well. I really appreciate the both of you. I'm sure we will have you on here in the near future as we continue to look over maybe the first 100 days of the Biden administration, especially when it comes to some of these issues we talked about here tonight. So thank you both for joining us. Well, the YWCA of South Florida is on its own mission to improve social justice in our area. It's a campaign called Until Justice, Just Is. Carrie-Ann Royce is the organization's CEO. She joins us now tonight to talk a little bit more about this campaign. And thank you so much, Carrie-Ann, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Joanne. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. So tell me, what does social justice in South Florida look like to you?
Well, systemic racism really just touches and affects every life in social justice. We all have skin in the game, whether you are brown, an immigrant, a person who was born here. We have everything from health access to educational equity to full participation in the economy. To us at YWCA, social justice means that all women and people of color have access to healthcare, education, career development, and opportunities, that they'd be free from discrimination or harassment in the workplace or in public, free from sexual and gun violence in the home or at school, and free from racial profiling and heightened surveillance tactics and targeted enforcement strategies. Our YWCA programs, we've been here 100 years, are really focused, every single program, on addressing an existing racial or gender inequity issue. And we have to get to the core of that if we really want to see the changes that we know are really important to moving the needle. So we have programs that build equity for economic opportunities that are designed to advance women and people of color in our inclusive economy, or to create an inclusive economy. We provide family learning centers that provide high quality early education and curriculum that closes that knowledge gap and prepares children in underserved brown communities to enter school at an equal level as their peers that are more affluent. We provide education and annual screenings to prevent uninsured women of color from dying at disproportionate rates of breast and cervical cancers. Human rights programs to support women and families facing domestic violence and criminal and civil matters in the courthouses. And we lead community conversations and campaigns and initiatives, this creative problem solving, this civic action. We know that if we keep doing, we're going to see this until justice, and social justice happen when we see the world seeing women, girls, and people of color the way that we do, which is equal, powerful, and unstoppable.
And with that, let's ask you, and you're breaking up a little bit, so we're going to try and bear with you. But I want to ask you, what is Until Justice Just Is, as far as the campaign is concerned? What is this?
I'm so sorry about our technical issues, but I hope power through them and let me know if you're still experiencing that. Until Justice Just is a way in which each and every one of us gets to stay engaged in the journey. Equity is everybody's responsibility. The campaign is a rally cry and a steady designed to keep a consistent call for us to address systemic racism. So we kicked it off with MLK Day of Service, and we're very close to Black History Month. And that was deliberate because we wanted to create an effort which provided a healthy tension in South Florida's community around racial justice issues. We really build on the concept, if you think about it, of herd immunity and compound effect. If there's a large enough proportion of us in the community that are educated and inoculated against the disease of racism, we can control its impact. And that's what we seek to do with Until Justice, is to build enough education and inoculation within our community that the disease of racism is controlled. And if we do that measurably and consistently over time, we will see the compound effect of justice realizing itself and being until justice just is. There'll be a series of education webinars, our 21-day challenge, Shop Bold, which is an initiative to help you to shop in Black-owned businesses. And of course, we're going to grow our civic engagement through this campaign.
All right, Karen Rose, and that was my last question. I was going to ask you about what is Shop Bold, but you just hit it right there. I want to thank you so much for joining us and the YWCA. You guys are doing a lot in our community, and we really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a great evening, Joanne. Thanks for having us.
You got it. Carrie Ann Rose, thank you.
Thank you.
And finally, we couldn't let this night pass without remembering NBA legend and great Kobe Bryant. We lost him and his 13-year-old daughter, Gigi, and 7 others a year ago today in a tragic helicopter crash. Bryant's widow, Vanessa, asked that we celebrate their lives. We could spend the rest of the evening talking about his vast accomplishments and how he inspired so many of us on and off the court. But instead, we will simply say Kobe Bryant and his daughter will simply be dearly missed. Well, that's it for tonight's show. You can watch this program on Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. Remember to follow me on Instagram or Twitter at JawanNBC6. And before we go, you heard it there from some of our guests. Education is the key to success. If you believe, you will succeed. Have a great night.